So this morning I want to talk about something that's probably near and dear to everybody's heart, and that, of course, is status, sex, and gender. So let's get started. So, in order to talk about any of these things, because many things like race, ethnicity, gender, these are social constructs. These are defined by the society. Each and every society, we think that some of these are universals, right? Race is a universal thing. Well, then why does the United States have 5 races and Mexico used to have 16? Why are there more than 50 racial categories in not in Portugal, but in Brazil, if race is a constant? And the same is true with gender. Normally, we think of the gender binaries of male and female, but many societies have 3rd and 4th genders. We're actually, even within some subcultures here in the United States, we have 5 and 6 genders. So things like gender, sex, status, race, ethnicity, these are all social constructs, and they are imbued to us through what's referred to as habitus. This is the process whereby you acquire the socialization skills. You learn about interaction between you and other people. You learn about how the society you live in, works, how you can function within it. And so these are areas where this is how you acquire it. It's through this process of socialization. And it starts in the family, and then it goes in concentric circles out. We've talked about this before. Family, however, pretty much remains the primary source of socialization. And then I would say that the next biggest in the developed world, of course, is school. And then finally, after that would be your work or your profession. Almost all societies, even those that claim to be classless, do have classes. They have a social hierarchy. And this is a classic one. This is a medieval hierarchy, but you could substitute, putting the working class at the bottom and the middle class at the area of the knights, and our oligarchs are our 1%ers up at the lords and vassals, and then the king at the top being the chief oligarch. So, depending on how the election of 2020 goes, we could look even more like that, or we could deviate a little bit. But this type of structure has existed and has been imposed fairly regularly for a couple of thousand years, if not before, if not longer. And really this comes with, and we're going to have a big discussion at some point this semester about agriculture. In hunting and gathering societies, everyone is equal. Everyone has a role to play. It may be a gendered role, but everyone has a role, and everyone shares equally in the results. Once you have agriculture, you need to defend that land. You need to have specialized workers to work that land. That frees up people. Then other people need to learn how to do accounting. They need to learn how to do to develop storage techniques. They need to have record keeping. They have to all. And so what happens is, once you get agriculture, the society begins to stratify. And what was once an egalitarian society where everyone was truly equal, you end up in a society where some are more equal than others, and this is very common. The term social organization refers to how individuals perceive the structure and the context of every situation we're in, and we do this subconsciously. You behave differently with your family than you do with your closest friends, than you do on your first date, than you do on when you're out in public with a group, or maybe it's just one individual, or individually. You behave differently when you are talking to your professors, or to your minister, or your priest, or your rabbi, or your mullah, or to people that you're deferential to, people who are wealthy or better educated. Right? We know the rules. This is why it's always interesting when you go to another society or another culture, because the rules are different in every culture. A few years ago, I spent 3 weeks in Eastern Europe, And every night I went out on the town. I went out to sit in the pubs and the town squares, the village squares, the city squares, depending on where I was, and whether I was in Prague or whether I was in Budapest or whether I was in Vienna. Going out into the streets and talking to people, you realize just how different cultures can be in this concept of social organization. The breakdown of barriers, or the different types of barriers, is very much culturally created. And so these are set upon, understood structures, rules that we all agree to, whether we think we agree to them or not. Just by the way that we function in society, we have agreed to adhere to them. Just like we stop at the stoplight. It might be a rolling stop, but it's a stop. We stay close to the speed limit, and it's marked 25. We're doing 40, but at least we're not doing 70, right? And that's because social organization does allow for variations in behavior. And actually, behaviors that are repeated, that are successful, will ultimately be incorporated back into the culture and make a little bit of change. But culture doesn't necessarily change 180 degrees overnight. It can't. Cultural change, social change takes time, because it has to become normalized. It has to trickle down through the society, and for that behavior and those expectations and that status to all become normal. And this idea of acquiring, this socialization, acquiring these things that make you you, starting on your mother's knee and then going to your family, your extended family, your religious organizations, your school, your work in these concentric circles that come out from from the core, are impacted by what we refer to as practice. And practice is the ability to make choices. And that ability to make choices we refer to as agency. Now, you probably remember in some of the earlier lectures when I talked about various theories, agency was often the one thing in the 19th and early 20th century that was left out of all the theories. The notion was that if you could just figure out how society works, you could lock it in place and say, this is what it is. But the problem is that societies and cultures change over time. How do they change? Well, they change at the individual level, and then that individual change then gets moved into the collective. And so that ability to act, which we really didn't recognize globally throughout both in sociology and anthropology, that concept of agency really isn't recognized and understood until the 60s. It's during the protests in Berkeley and UCLA and UCSF, San Francisco City College. It is at that particular point when the scholars at Berkeley and UCLA and in Oxford begin looking at this concept of agency, the ability of the individual to choose. And it is Pierre Bourdieu, who, the French sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, who says, wait a minute, agency has limits. Before we considered agency, it was, this is how the machine works, but then it didn't account for change. We add agency, and when we first put in agency as a concept, when we try to start testing it out, we start seeing that, yes, people have choices, but the choices they make are determined by the structure of the society or culture in which they're in. In other words, you don't ever decide to go 180 degrees from your cultural norms. If you did, you would be considered insane or crazy or lawless or whatever. And so most of us make incremental changes. Right? We may have a 15-degree range of options on any particular thing. Agency says, you know what, we can make that 20, not 360. It just expanded a little bit. And if you succeed, then you have expanded your practice. You've expanded what is acceptable. And that now becomes part of the norm. And then you can push it again a little bit to the edges. But even the most radical thinkers only ever just take what we have, what we already understood, and just change it a little bit. You're able to have any world you want but because of the way that cultures and societies change, you can only make small incremental change that over time will have a large impact. But it is, you understand, agency is limited, but it is how change happens. Let's talk some more definitions here. Social status is that culturally defined position or rank that a person occupies in society. So, for example, in our situation, I have a higher social status than the students simply because I am paid to be here and you're paying to be here. When we are having a discussion, I have a higher social status because I have more degrees than you do. Doesn't mean I'm better than you. It's just that my status gives me a certain ability of prestige or social standing. You're just as smart as I am. You just don't have as much knowledge in specific areas. You probably know a lot more about other things that I don't know about, and that would make you the expert, and in that case, you would have the higher status. Status it fluctuates. Now, the social role is how people with a status behave. So if you think of a very strict, it's often better to look at an outside culture to try to recognize some of these things as opposed to looking at your own and seeing it, because we don't believe we have social roles or social status in the United States. I was in a Ph.D. seminar years ago, and a grad student, one that already had a master's degree, said, well, the United States is a classless society, and I about fainted. Because if it was a classless society, then you and I'd be having lunch with Donald Trump and the DeVosses. We're not, right? We don't hang out with the ultra rich. We don't get invited onto Kanye's floating mansion, his new yacht. We have a lower social status and we perform lower social roles. But it's easier to see it if you look at another culture. So if you look at, say, like old English movies, right? All of the smart people have very posh London accents, as opposed to all the farmers or all of the lower class, working class people who are a good cop gov, very, very condescending, or not condescending, but deferential to those with higher status. And it's often easier to see it by looking at another culture than by looking at your own. Now, there are two types of status. There is ascribed status. This is status that you inherit. It could be a status of a very wealthy person or the status of a very poor person. It is simply status that by having been born, in our society, males have a higher status than female. That's an ascribed status. May not admit that, but they do. It is something they are born with, a status that you are born with, as opposed to achieved status, which is you did something to gain that. And all of us are a combination of achieved and ascribed statuses. For example, my ascribed status is I'm white and I'm male. I have privilege. My achieved status is my degrees, my success in my teaching, what little fame and fortune I got as a broadcaster, as an author, as a writer. I did something, I ascribed, I earned achieved status. And sometimes you don't even know you get it. Years ago when I was at UCLA, I got a call one morning from my mother. Congratulations. I said, for what? She goes, don't you know? I said, no, what? And I had written a little piece of shareware software decades ago when we were still under, before Windows, it was still DOS PCs. And it got a great write-up in one of the mainline computer magazines. And I still have that article. It's framed and it's in my office above one of my windows. Because for a minute, I got my 15 minutes of fame. And each of us, as we go through life, we will get those achieved statuses. Whether we graduate from college or whether we earn an award or whether we win the lottery or whatever. These are achieved statuses that we did something to get it. And it's that it's that combination of achieved and ascribed statuses that often it gets confusing. For example, in American culture, by the fact that I have testicles, not ovaries, and the fact that I have very little melanin in my skin, gives me a higher ascribed status than women and people of color. I have to admit that. I have to acknowledge that. Because if I pretend I earned that status, that it was actually achieved status, then I might have something to brag about. But because society just said, look, you don't have a vag, dude. You're better than her. Your hair is straight. Your eyes are rounded. You have all of the ascribed attributes that we give status to. I didn't do anything to earn that status. And yet, it gives me privilege. As does my achieved status. The fact that you all call me doctor. And if you don't, I probably won't listen. I worked hard to achieve that. You have no idea how hard it was to go from where I started to where I ended up academically. Some of you are experiencing similar situations. Some of you are trying to achieve status to overcome the drawbacks of your ascribed status. So ascribed status, that which you get just by being born, includes your age, right? You can't change your age. We give deference to more mature people until they get so mature that they're senile. Sex and gender. They're two separate things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But sex and gender do in most societies have some form of ascribed status. Race, caste, socioeconomic class, nationality, ethnicity, religion. You just go down the list. All of the things that we divide ourselves along are related to ascribed status. Because the people that had a certain combination of these early on decided those were the good things. And we've measured everything up to this point by that particular measuring stick. And so, until we acknowledge that, with the exception of maybe age, and to a certain degree gender and sex, I can't do anything about any of those. I can change my religion. For all you know, I may have. Right? These are ascribed status. These are statuses that are ascribed. Now, religion you can change. You can change your nationality, but it's pretty big. It's pretty hard to do. Even if you do, you'll still retain attachment to your some attachment either internally or externally to your original nationality. Achieved statuses are that's an interesting way that flowed, are those things that you achieve, right? Your marital status, married or single, divorced, widowed. Those are statuses, right? These are all the things that you check off on the boxes. Your parental status. I used to be someone's child. All of the people in my parents' generation have already passed on, so I don't have that. I don't have that status anymore, but I am a parent. I have a daughter and a son. And I have status that's associated with that. I achieved a certain level of educational and occupational success. When I was a disc jockey, I worked at the #1 station in a top 50 market for years. When I finished my Ph.D., I did a pretty good job of it. These are things that I achieved, and I get patted on the back for it. Socioeconomic class has very little to do actually with the amount of money you have. Right? You often hear about nouveau riche or the new rich or or the rich white trash as opposed to the poor white trash. One of the problems that Donald Trump had in New York all those years was that the New York elite looked at this guy from Jersey and didn't include him. He was never part of the 400. He had money, but not that much. It was, in New York, there's the reason he didn't carry New York when he ran the first time. Because they didn't view him with the same status that the rest of the country did. The rest of the country had seen him on TV, listened to the stories that he was so rich, and went, oh yeah, he'd be great. The people who knew him the best, they viewed him with a different status. Nationality you can change through naturalization. Your ethnicity you can actually move away from it or become part of. I'll give you a prime example. Let's think of some some black politicians that have succeeded very, very highly. Barack Obama was raised by middle-class whites, well-educated middle-class whites, but middle-class whites. It wasn't until he went to college that he embraced African-American culture, the music, the art, the ways of speaking. He achieved the status of not just being black, because his father was not an African American, he was an African. And so Barack Obama was never an African American by birth, but he became one. Kamala Harris, her father's black, her mother is Indian, South Asian Indian. And she claims both. But is she, right? That's ascribed. But what does she mostly identify as? She mostly identifies as black. So she has been able to achieve a certain status. Religion, you can convert. Happens all the time. People get sexual reassignment surgeries all the time. I have a colleague who I went through my master's program with who disappeared from Facebook for a while. Next time she popped up, she was no longer a he. And just this last summer went through the final operations and now is as fully female as one can get without going in and putting thicker brow ridges or reconstructing the pelvis. Gender. Gender is a socially ascribed role. Things that are masculine in one society are feminine in others. And so gender, which, like I said, we usually think about it as a binary, male and female. But what if you have male sex organs, but you perform the roles in society of a woman? Which gender are you? Your sex, your biological sex, is male. Your sexuality might be male, might be hetero, might be gay, it might be all kinds of stuff. But what is your gender? Right? They're different. Sex is what's hanging between my legs or not hanging between my legs. Sexuality is who do I want to sleep with? And gender is what role, based on society's rules, do I play? If I'm female and I want to be a welder, I'm going against gender norms. But I can create that as a new construct. So what this status does is it indicates who has authority and who doesn't, who gets listened to and who doesn't, who has access to power. How is equality or inequality manifest within the society? That often has to do with status. In the 60s we learned, and we're doing it again now finally, is that you need people at different levels to be part of your social movement for a variety of reasons. If you want to change the world, you have to get a broad coalition pulled together in order to do that. Also, a lot of status has to do with what's important in a society. 20 years ago, the top 3 professions as far as social status were doctor, lawyer, and professor. After 40 years of the denigration of higher education, I don't think professors still in the top 3. I don't know that it should have been, but it was. Right? Once we stopped prioritizing education in our society and started vilifying people with educations, that status changed. Did they change? No. Their status, their how they're perceived by society did. Age and sex are the 2 most common, right? And they're the most visible other than race and possibly ethnicity. We have lots and lots of often unspoken societal norms that are dealing with both age and sex. Confucianism would be a perfect example of this, where all of the sayings of Confucius deal with your obligations or your privileges based on your social status and your relationship to other people, to older people in your family, younger people in your family, older people in public, older people in government, younger people in society, poorer people in society, richer people in society. So age and sex has a lot to do with these relationships, right? And they can be relations of power, or they can be relations of equality. So for example, adult and child. Generally, the adult has the power, although children, that's a whole different story. The relationship between a husband and a wife, their status, depending on their society and depending on their own relationship. Are they equals? Does society view them as equals? Here in California, for example, if my wife were to divorce me, she would get half of what I own. If I were to divorce her, I would get half of what she owns, or half of what we owned together. But we lived in Ohio for 2 years, and we bought a house while we were there. The house could only be put in my name because I had genitals that were on the outside. I could not put her name on the deed. This was in the 90s. This wasn't that long ago. I hope it's changed. But instead of being a community property state like California, where the moment we buy the house, whether it's in my name or her name or our name, it's our house, and so she gets half of it when she leaves, or it automatically inherits it when she dies because she already owns it. We own it collectively. In Ohio, every year that we remained married after the purchase of that house, she upped her dower percentage of the property. In fact, so in every year, and I think it took like 12 or 15 years, every year she got a little bit more until she became almost equal. So she and I might consider ourselves equal, but the law there considered me to be more equal than her. There's also often different statuses between a mother and a father and the daughter and the son, crosswise and whatever. Of course, brothers and sisters, there's always a hierarchy there. There may be differences in the way they're treated. Some societies favor boys so much over girls that they will kill the girl babies. So these statuses are you can't change these that often. I can't change my age. I wish I could. So we look at things like, how do you define the difference between young and old? I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, I met her when I was in grad school. She was still an undergrad and anthropologist. And she wanted to go on to grad school and get a master's, which she did eventually get in osteology, and then she was working on a Ph.D. But when she got her master's degree, which was strictly bones, it was biological, but primarily human and primate skeletons, she had this notion for grad school that what she wanted to study was the impact of work on children in different traditional societies. And she kept writing this up and submitting it to Ph.D. programs and kept getting rejected. And so I couldn't figure out why she was getting rejected, because she was smart, she had great grades. And so we started talking about her research proposal. And when she told me about it, I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. She goes, well, of course it does. You know, in societies where children aren't forced to work, do they have better outcomes than those societies that children have to have roles where they're actually working within the society? And she's not talking about, you know, child labor in the Industrial Revolution. She's talking about traditional societies like Native Americans or village people in India or Africa or whatever. I said, well, number one, the terminology that you're using doesn't work. And she goes, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you're not defining what you mean by work, number one, and number two, by child. Are you talking toddler? Are you talking, under 12? Are you talking under 25? And she said, well, you know, the biological definition of children. I said, what is the biological definition of children? And she goes, well, we include, you know, the merging of the plates of the skull, this, that, and it went through a whole long list. And I went, but even those are different in every individual, and they happen over a course of 30 years. So you're going to say things like the meshing of the skull, which doesn't happen until your late 20s, is an indication that you're a child. And so we went around and around and around for her trying to develop and distinguish between what is old and what is young in her proposal for her research. And once she did that one thing, once she said, okay, ages from this to this, and by work I mean doing these activities and these activities as opposed to this activity. Once she was able to do that, she got accepted, and last I heard, was still working on her Ph.D. But you know, if you're going to use a term as innocuous, as common as ageism, right? When I was your age, we didn't trust anybody over 30, right? I remember hitting 30 and thinking, oh my God, I'm old. That was 35 years ago. How do you think I feel now? Actually, I don't feel any different than I did when I was 17. That's the crazy part. How do we distinguish the difference between male and female? Well, biologically, we can check to see what genitalia they have. Except for the fact that about 1 out of every 1,500 births is ambiguous. Either a clitoris large enough to be a penis, labia majora that may or may not have dropped, testicles that may not have dropped. And in the past, when these births happened, very often the hospitals where the children were born would just automatically fix it. They would do a gender reassignment surgery to the baby, usually before the mother even got to hold him. I'm talking in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because it would be easier for the child then, and for the parents, than for having this ambiguous entity that isn't clear. And a lot of mistakes are made. And the XY chromosome thing, we just figured that out a couple of decades ago. Prior to that, it was strictly based on external presentation of genitalia. And so, you know, my favorite example of this is my son has some friends, twins, one male, one female. Neither is all that, you know, they're rather coarse as far as their features. Wonderful people. But from an aesthetic standpoint, the sister isn't all that pretty and the brother isn't all that handsome. Or did I mention that the brother was gay? In other words, he's attracted to men. And that's perfectly acceptable. But when you have twins, oftentimes they're exactly this. You know, they're exactly the same in almost everything. And to be different in gender, which does happen in, or it's not one egg splitting, but it's two eggs. So you can have that happen. But if it's one egg splitting into two, and one comes out male and one comes out female, that doesn't happen. And so if they are from a single egg, in DNA they should be 100% exactly the same, then and this is a question I've always wanted to ask but don't have the cojones to actually ask it, was the male twin reassigned to that gender at birth incorrectly and then struggled with his sexuality because he should have been a she and should have been attracted to males according to the rules, right? And so where does that definition fall, right? And like I said, there are multiple genders. We'll talk about that as we go on. We often look at different age cycles or life cycles. And in the West, we pretty much agree on birth, adolescence to adulthood, becoming a parent, middle age, senior years, death, right? Those are kind of the arc of our trajectory. That varies from culture to culture. But it is a way for us to assign status. It's a way for us to understand in a quick, take a look around the room and try to figure out what's going on way without having to actually get to know the people. We can look at people and make quote-unquote judgments based on their ages. Probably incorrectly, but that's how we do it. Now, sex is the dialogical difference between male and female, and that includes the genitalia, and it includes the XY chromosomes, and it is determined by the hormones. There are structural, skeletal differences between men and women. The most striking of which is the pelvic notch. Women have about a 90-degree angle. Men have about a 30-degree angle on the notch in their pelvis. That's to allow the baby to pass through it. The male pelvic notch actually is better for standing upright, physical activity, things like that, than the other one because there's much more meat or much more bone in meat of the bone, much more bone involved in that pelvic floor, and so not the floor, but the sides of the pelvis, so that it is much stronger in males than it is in females, and yet females are the ones that have to have the birth. The other indicators, like the brow ridge on males tends to be much, I'm talking about where your eyebrows sit. There's a ridge above your eyes. If you're female, that ridge doesn't jut out very much, if at all. In fact, it should be very rounded. If you were to shave your eyebrows off and look very closely, you would see that your forehead comes down. It doesn't jut out before it goes back into the eye socket. It comes down straight. On a male, the older you get, once you're past about 25, you begin to develop thicker brow ridges. This is one of the reasons why with adolescent males it's impossible to determine the sex based on the skull alone because it's ambiguous. Young males have less of a brow ridge than older males. And women tend to have less of a brow ridge than men. However, there are women with significant brow ridges. So you have to take all of these pieces into consideration. Now, the sex role. This is the gender role. This is that external, societally determined role of what behavior patterns or jobs or whatever are you allowed to do as a member of one gender or the other. And so that sex role, I'm not talking about sex workers here, that's a different issue. And even there, the sex role becomes a big issue because you may want different, you may have different appetites. But the sex role is what you perform. So if you are a guy and you love cleaning house and doing dishes, you are performing a female gendered role. But if you only get an erection with a naked woman and not a naked man, you're not gay. You haven't changed your sex or your biological sex or your sexuality. You're performing female roles just as a woman being a welder is performing traditionally assigned male roles, right? They have nothing to do with sex or gender. Gender is this social and cultural classification that determines in our world binary, masculine, feminine. What roles do you play? These are the expectations that the expectations that society has of men and women as to how they behave and what they do in any particular society in any particular situation. These include things like the division of labor, right? We just talked about that. This is women's work, this is men's work. Clothing, right? I'd be willing to bet that 90% of the women in this class are technically cross-dressing. Because 50 years ago, the pants or the jeans that they're wearing, the t-shirt that they're wearing, those were the realm of men. Women didn't wear pants. When my mother was a school teacher in the 1960s and we went to Glenham, South Dakota, population 167, her contract, which hadn't been changed since the late 40s, designated how many petticoats she had to wear under her skirt. Now, they didn't enforce it, but she wasn't allowed to wear slacks. Now, we lived in South Dakota. It gets friggin' cold. My mother never drove. We walked or rode bicycles. We had to walk to school. We actually had to walk to work in blizzards. Well, running around in a skirt in a blizzard sucks. So she would have to wear pants underneath her work clothes in order to get to the building and then take them off because her gendered roles said she had to dress a certain way. Now we're getting farther and farther away from that, but it would still turn heads if I show up to class in a dress, especially with my beard. The way we behave, right? Oh, you're not acting very ladylike. Right? Think of the language we use and how we reinforce these roles all the time. Man up. Put on your big boy pants. Right? Don't be, oh, she's pushy. She's nasty. Right? Gendered terms, which create all kinds of connotations in our brain that most of the time we don't even think about. We don't even consider it. It just comes out. In the race class, I watch a video that goes through a whole bunch of common sayings, things that we use in general language, which all have racial overtones, racial or ethnic overtones, that we've given up on. That we've forgotten what the original meaning is, but they all come from a racialized or ethnic place. So that's gender. So the notion of gender makes the assumption that men and women are essentially social constructs. Gender is the social construct, not sex. And this is played out. There's nobody, and I don't think in any of my classes, who is currently a gender studies student. But gender studies isn't just women's studies. It would be called women's studies if it is. I remember I was at a faculty orientation at a school I taught at many years ago that I'm not teaching at anymore because I really hated it. But a fellow instructor said to me, well, I can't imagine taking a women's history class from anything but a woman. And I said, well, does that mean that you can only take Roman history from a dead Italian? My research is primarily in African American communities. I go to conferences where I'm one of 3 white people sometimes. I have chosen to do the unexpected, and sometimes it works to my advantage, and sometimes it doesn't. But the idea of gender is specific and unique to each culture. So there are variations. These are not pretty women. These are the Wadabi men of Niger. They dress up for festivals at least once a year in this type of outfit with all this makeup, with this excited big eyes and the big open smile. And this is how masculinity is measured in their specific culture. Transvestism. Why am I having trouble saying transvestite? early morning, I guess. This notion of cross-dressing is common and universal. I mean, there was a governor of New York under King George who his official portrait that hangs in the State House today, his official portrait was him in a dress and a 5 o'clock shadow. I mean, there's nothing new. People have been doing what they do today forever. And so part of what confuses the issue, especially of things like transvestitism and transgender, is that our society says these are the norms. You change those norms, you buck those norms, and unless you're doing it for comedic effect, you get confused. You know, this is, I don't know if anybody here has ever read an Archie comic. They were big when I was a kid back in the 60s, but Archie was a redheaded guy that went to Riverdale High, and this was a strip in which he woke up one morning in a woman's body. And how would his life be different? An interesting concept of it. Interesting. But gender, as I said, can be very, very fluid. And so, for example, just look at here in the United States, Native American tribes. We've kind of lumped together these third and fourth genders into a term that we get from one of them called the Berdache. And that is a member of the society that at a young age was assigned the duties of the other gender. Now, it has nothing to do with their sexuality. They may be gay, they may be straight. They may be asexual, they may be pansexual. Doesn't matter. The roles they perform in society. So in a traditional native village, you would have a young boy at age 8 or 9 that the tribe would decide, or the parents would decide, or the chiefs would decide that that's going to be a Berdache. That child is going to switch roles. And for the rest of his life, he's still male, but he dresses as female and he does female jobs. And then may go home to his wife. It is a formal part of traditional native society. We see this in India. We see this in some other places around the world where this alternate gender or genders can be incorporated into society quite normally for much of its existence. Many of the groups, the Native American groups in what's now the United States, often referred to this as a two-spirit. It's kind of a contemporary expression, but it kind of sums up what how they viewed it. And it is they have the spirit of their biological sex, but then the spirit of the gender, the roles that they perform in society. And so they are of both spirits, which makes them special, makes them better. Right? This is not a put-down. Being a Berdache is a very special situation. It is a high status. Just like in many societies, if you live to be 55 years or older, you have achieved the highest status anybody can make, because people die younger. There are societies where certain diseases, like epilepsy, is considered a plus. If you ever get a chance to read The Spirit Catches You and Then You Fall Down, about a Hmong child here in the valley, just outside of, I think it's up in Madeira. Might have been Merced. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. But one of the reasons that she had difficulties when the family moved here back in the 80s was that the Hmong culture itself revered this young girl as an epileptic, that those seizures were when she was touched by the supernatural world. But the medical community that was trying to treat her epilepsy saw her epilepsy as a problem. They would give the family drugs. The family wouldn't give them the drugs because then the seizures would stop. And what made her special ceased to exist. So it's again, this is all socially constructed. Other examples in India, you have the Hijra, which are men Again, sexually, their sexuality may be gay, straight, bi, trans, whatever. But they are most comfortable dressing in women's clothing, but they don't over-sexualize it. In fact, they're really quite masculine in their female dress. And so much so that in Pakistan, which used to be part of India, in Pakistan, the Pakistani government now hires Hijra. This is a heavily Muslim country. They hire transvestites as tax collectors. And this is on business taxes. So what happens is let's say your business doesn't pay the income tax this year, or the whenever you pay it, monthly, yearly, whatever. The government will then send a group of transvestites to your store to collect the taxes, because it is unlike with the British tradition. Here, this third gender is a lower status, and if you've got a bunch of these people in your store, you might want to get them out of there as quickly as possible, so you'll pay your taxes so the rest of the customers don't come in. It works great. They dress and act as women, but they don't sexualize it. Now, this is actually a rather pretty one. Similarly, the Kathoi in Thailand, these are trans. These are generally male. They are very, very sexualized. They will remove ribs. They will do the breast implants. They will have all kinds of surgeries and injections and everything to make them as feminine, as hyper-feminine as possible. Some will retain their external genitalia, others will have them changed. But it's a huge part of Thailand tourism is the Thai ladyboys, as they're referred to. And so they could be gay, they could be straight. It depends on whether they've had the surgery. I mean, if you're sleeping with a person who's had full sexual reconstruction, which it gets so confusing. But they're very flexible. They're very they're very, very popular. In fact, some of the most popular mainstream entertainers in Thailand are Kathoi. The same with a lot of the sex workers. It's a specialty. Men go to Thailand specifically to sample the ladyboys. Now, culture and law often has a lot to do with controlling sexuality. Right? A woman's right to choose, right? Who gets to determine what goes on in her body? Well, because she's a woman, in our society, men do. Try and limit access to Viagra the same way you limit access to abortion or birth, even birth control, and you'll see a very different approach. And so it is the society that determines the acceptability or the lack of acceptability of certain sexual behaviors or practices. And you know what most of these are. Masturbation. Ooh, it's a nasty thing. Right? If you ate cornflakes in the last week, you actually digested an anti-masturbatory aid. Cornflakes were developed along with graham crackers and things like All Bran were developed because Kellogg's, Post, and Graham, 3 19th century health food nuts, determined that spicy food made you horny. And so if you gave children bland food and lots of enemas, they wouldn't masturbate. And so cornflakes were actually developed as a bland food. So now you got sugar-coated cornflakes, you got Cheerios with cinnamon in it, you got graham crackers with cinnamon. These guys would be rolling in their graves if they knew what you had done to their anti-masturbatory foods. These were supposed to lower the libido. Society determines the acceptability or non-acceptability of premarital or extramarital sex. I get a kick out of my students in history. I'll be talking about, in the 50s, we'll be talking about the Kinsey Reports, which really shocked Americans because these were reports about male and female sexuality, one in 53, one in 57, and they interviewed thousands and thousands of Americans, and they pulled notions and approaches and attitudes towards sex that were completely contrary to what the society thought were our attitudes towards sex. Anybody thinking back at the 50s thinks of wholesomeness and mom and apple pie and leave it to Beaver and father knows best and all that bullshit, the let's make America great again bullshit. But if you actually read the Kinsey Reports, 1 out of every 3 men reported having had at least one homosexual encounter. Now, whether that means they actually performed a homosexual act or it got kind of close or whatever, but that was this 1 out of 3. 50% of men in the 50s admitted to premarital sex. I'm sorry, it was closer to 70%. 30% of the women. Same with extramarital sex. 50% of the males admitted to extramarital sex. Almost 25% of the women. And as far as different kinks and alternative sexualities, those were never acknowledged in the mainstream, but they actually existed at significant rates throughout society. This is one of the things that caused the sexual revolution of the 60s. You bring out these reports that say, look, you might get turned on by looking at a dog. You're one out of every 20 people that gets hot by looking at a bitch. All of a sudden, you go, well, society says I can't do that. And yet these are normal, or are they normal, right? But something a little less weird than bestiality, maybe like for example, maybe a woman should have an orgasm. There's an entire book called The Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan in the 1960s, which contributes significantly to second wave feminism, that says, basically the problem is that men don't think women can have an orgasm. I hate to tell you this, guys, they can. And it's your job to do it. If not, they'll take it into their own hands. Yeah, that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to talk about today on status, sex, and gender. Talk to you next time.